Because she was sending us questions yesterday with Jesse.
I only know that I am supposed to give you roughly 15 minutes. And
she was sending us like a bunch of questions yesterday night.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen. It was supposed to be Julia Mojo, so I'm sure she got them, but not me.
You're the moderator, are you? Yes.
I
thought you were talking.
Yeah. So I'll try to be moderate.
You're such a nice
my moderation. My understanding is that both of you will have 15 minutes.
I don't
each.
want to speak very long.
15 minutes.
15. Yeah, and what I have is very
Then
basic.
it's fine. If you're shorter, especially if you're shorter, then we may need to have the main
Mine
questions.
are on the, can I? Yeah.
Your presentation is left-right, so it goes like this.
Left.
Yeah, if you go right, then you advance. Yeah? So this is...
So go right.
Yes, go right.
That's grand. I'm ready whenever you are.
Yeah.
I'm organised.
I want to ask you all to move forward so we can put the volume down so we don't bother the other working group. Also you in the back there, move forward. They don't have their ears in.
Yes. I have to check the list. Oh, what a big light there. Hello. Let me see. Can I have the main mic? Hello. Testing. Good. Hello, everyone. Please take your coffee. Take your coffee, take your drink, have a sit, and welcome. Welcome to workshop number 1. My name is Dan Dogi. I'm from Romania. I'm head of the OSCE ODIHR's contact point for Roma and Sinti issues. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. For this panel, I'll be playing the moderator and steer a little bit the discussions on the topic of the European Commission, anti-Gypsyism and hate speech policy impacts. We have 2 speakers, Anastasia Krikli, chairperson, Pavi Point from Ireland, and Yamen Gabriela Hrabanyova, director, European Roma Grassroots Organization Network, ERGO. The rapporteur of the workshop is next to me here, Angela Evenhuis, consultant, International Network Against Cyber Hate, INACH. Without further ado, I would pass the floor now to Anastasia Krikli. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Is there any logistic or technical information? Yeah.
We'll do the best we can. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much, everybody. If I speak slowly, if I speak rapidly, you won't understand. And if I speak slowly, there will be noise in and out between. So I'll try and go a little bit in the middle. I don't think having listened carefully to this morning's discussion, I'm not sure there's a lot we need to add before we create conditions for a really good conversation here. Where I want to come from is not to repeat European Union instruments, which I think you did very well this morning, Gabriela, and also Irina did too. So I think, but what I wanted to do is to speak a little bit from my own experience, in particular in both the national and the global constructs. And my starting point is very much what I said earlier at the plenary session. that national as well as regional policies have not really taken on board anti-Gypsyism. And in effect, by omission, on a number of occasions, they have been patronising, they have been prejudiced, and overall, they have in effect furthered the experience that Roma, Sinti, and travellers in Ireland have of anti-Gypsyism. Now, I want to go back a little bit, though, to say, first of all, that anti-Gypsyism is a form of racism. And I think from that point of view, it's the main thing for me to remember is always all of our countries have signed up to the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And that makes it very clear that a racist experience is one that happens on purpose or in effect. And I'm very conscious that many of the instruments that have been developed to address anti-Gypsyism ignore that second bit, in effect. That in effect the outcomes, the impact and the experience is very often one of anti-Gypsyism. I would also, though, I think it's important to say that there are no hierarchies of oppression. Anti-Gypsyism is a form of racism, but there are very particular experiences within different forms of racism, some of which have precedence at different points in time. And at the moment, as indeed was mentioned earlier, Islamophobia and racism on the basis of anti-Muslim sentiment does have precedent. But there is no doubt but that the sort of toxic global discourse that's been trumpeted by people who bear names like Trump are having an effect globally on creating the conditions for all forms of racism, including anti-Gypsyism. And I want to suggest that anti-Gypsyism as well is not a new phenomenon. It has been named very explicitly, and thanks very much to the work of many of you here, it's been named very explicitly in the past decade. But it's not a new phenomenon. And as chair of the United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I was very conscious of the extent to which states under review really, in the end, were presenting what was happening for Roma and Sinti and travellers as somewhat their own fault. Like failure to complete second-level education, failure to complete first-level education, failure to engage with employment initiatives, rather than presenting these as policy failures or as failures of legislation and failures of the policies involved to create conditions appropriate for people to engage with those particular initiatives. I'd like to suggest to you, though, overall with regard to racism, that the fact that hate crime has not been very successfully addressed in a number of European states, the fact that hate crime is not successfully addressed has created a difficulty when it comes to then considering hate speech either online or offline. If anti-Gypsyism then is a specific form of racism, I think acknowledging both the individual and the institutional levels is also important. And as I said, the historical as well as its current manifestations. But what has already been said too about it being widely and uniquely legitimised. People do not legitimise other forms of racism in the exact same way. And then currently amplified by social media and online hate speech. The tools that are available to eliminate today's manifestations are inadequate in themselves. Like incitement to hatred legislation, for example, has no real capacity to address online incidents and online manifestations which actually create the conditions one or two steps removed for incitement to hatred. The existing EU directives have some capacity, but not sufficient. The 99 directive on racism, which was the best we could get at the time, doesn't really take it on. And secondly, the voluntary code of practice, which maybe has some potential, but to be quite honest, the voluntary code of practice of the European Union by social media providers in 2016 is really more understood as to how it's actually breached. In reality, while potentially a useful tool in its own right, I'd suggest to you that such voluntary codes of practice need to be reinforced by reference to at least other global human rights instruments in order to have any capacity to deliver outcomes. Now, so therefore, what might be done, and these are just pointers for our discussion. Already we've spoken about the reality that anti-Gypsyism is on the European Parliament and the European Union agenda. But being on the agenda doesn't mean it is a sort of a fully integrated and included part of the practice. It's been proposed as part of the post-EU Roma Agenda 2020, but this requires considerable work in order to ensure that it stays not just a sort of another item to be dealt with, but a fully integrated and priority cross-cutting matter, which actually has a significant influence on the policy areas being considered as well. In effect, there was some consideration of discrimination in that regard in the last agenda, but I think this needs to be much more explicit if it's to have any effect. There is also the possibility of at least looking for EU legislation on the matter. And then I think as well, perhaps useful may be the use of, for example, the third general recommendation on hate speech as a mechanism for beginning a debate that goes beyond, particularly online, that confusion between the right to freedom of speech on one hand and the reality that hate speech is, online hate speech is a form of racism and explicitly a form of anti-Gypsyism. I've listed there some of the conditions that are looked at in that general recommendation 35, and if you look in particular at the reach of the hate speech, I mean the reach of online hate speech against Roma, Sinti and travellers can be very, very extensive. In moving this forward, I'd suggest though that we need to be careful not to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. I think that international human rights law, rather than this sort of general notion of corporate social responsibility, which tends to inform some of the voluntary engagement with the codes of practice that have been put in place for social media providers. I think a very hard-nosed, explicit engagement with international human rights law could provide a ground floor basis within which a number of the manifestations online could be considered. And could I also say that a collective reproach is required without parallel lines. In addressing online and offline hate, it seems to me that communities concerned to address racism have become paralleled, so that the community concerned to address Islamophobia and the community concerned to address anti-Gypsyism and other communities are almost not in competition, but in parallel lines with one another. And I do believe that to move this forward, there's a need for more collective approaches and more collaboration, which still allows for the uniqueness of each manifestation to be considered in its own right, and also allows for the very specific gendered forms of online hate and online anti-Gypsyism to be explicitly considered. Thank you very much.
And I thank you. I thank you very much, Anastasia. I've noted here down a number of aspects, very important, that while it's on the agenda, is not yet anti-Gypsyism is not yet fully integrated into the policy, and that more work needs to be done in this regard. I should add here the national dimension, because anti-Gypsyism has been recognized quite a lot in the past years at the level of European Union, obviously Council of Europe, as well as with the latest resolution of the European Parliament. However, now the next step is to see a transition towards an acknowledgement and recognition of this, and integration into the national integration policies of the definition and of the concept of the anti-Gypsyism at the national level. I would like now to pass the floor to Gabriela Hrabaneva.
Thank you. I might just have a practical recommendation. If people who doesn't hear good, well hear, maybe you can take a headset with an English. Like this, it goes directly to your ears.
Yes, could help.
I just don't know what is the cable, the number of the English.
5? I think
5.
Try 5.
Yeah, 6.
Okay.
So you can go on channel 6, and like this you might actually hear better without interruption. Yeah. I mean, you know, that's what we can do at this moment for kind of being kind of us going directly to your ears, right?
And hearts.
And hearts. I mean, yeah. And I think that, yeah, thanks actually, Dan, for this hook. Because I think what is actually happening, it's that the agenda that we are working on, it's one of the hardest one. I mean, we talk about centuries of oppression, centuries of hatred, centuries of exclusion, and on systematic even eradication of Romani people. And to change this actually cannot just happen from a day to another. And also what we very often do, and I think this is also kind of a critic to our own roles, that we work with papers, we work with the policies, but we kind of, you know, we have a very good reasons and arguments why things are actually should go some other direction, but we are still not touching very well the hearts of the people when it comes to actually making some changes, making things being affected, making things being implemented. So that's when it comes actually to this policy level, we are doing quite good. At the European level, people are understanding what is it, anti-Gypsyism. People are kind of bringing sort of the acknowledgement, sort of, you know, but we can see that we have some results there, like when it comes to papers, right? So we have papers which are having the word anti-Gypsyism reflected. We still don't have the understanding, and we still also don't know very well what to do. Or like maybe the institution doesn't know how to translate this, what kind of guidance they should be giving. So that's why we also moved from, as I was mentioning before, and I hope I'm not going to repeat myself so much here, why we are moving from this like understanding what is anti-Gypsyism to what exactly could be done about it. So what kind of measures, what kind of actions has to be taken place in place. We have no progress so far, and we don't know how actually this can be related. I think what is very important as well is to understand that every single guidance that is coming from the kind of above, which would be the EU level, or even we have OSCE here, or Council of Europe, who are actually also having plans, that without the work on the national level, without kind of building the coalition and alliances of those people who are living in their environment, we cannot translate those measures. So practically everything that is being proposed has to be nationalized, has to be localized. We have to be always sensitive to to the needs. But how we actually would be able to understand those needs? Are people ready, and are people kind of having an opportunities to get together and actually talk about their own needs and being listened? So into what terms the leadership of Roma, in our case Roma, is being supported? Where is there an independent voice, and are these independent voices supported to actually bringing forward their asks, and how also like we can support those Roma people who are actually bringing those needs together. So I know in Ergo we do a very little for it, but we still try to work on it. So first of all, we are building these coalitions on the EU level. So we bring together network. So we have different members in different countries, kind of bringing the knowledge, bringing the Roma realities to Brussels. So making sure, so it's not me sitting on the seat somewhere in Brussels office, kind of dictating what has to be done, but reflecting on what people are telling to us. One way of kind of gathering those information is through the monitoring that was mentioned by Elena. Other is that we really talk to people and we go and visit. We collect case studies. We are also analyzing different policies, if they're working well or not, and trying to reflect and bring this information to the Commission. But we are also working on coalition building. So we support coalitions in several countries, including here in Czech Republic. We have a little bit focus on anti-Gypsyism in Slovakia. In Hungary, it's very hard to work, but then still the work has to be done. In Romania, Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, there are 3 different coalitions of Romani organizations. So it's also, we see that also we also need still kind of to focus on how kind of Roma work together, and then to help to amplify the voice. So going beyond Roma, it would be the next step. So how we build the alliances with the kind of other groups than it's Roma. So today we have one fora which actually helps us to think of, how to bring our narrative and to kind of help to kind of build the alliance. But we also we can learn from the others. So there is already quite a lot done in the work of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, and other kind of racism. But also we know that these other groups also can learn from us. So the work of the people of African descent, they, for example, right now, they want to achieve what Roma already achieved when it comes to the framework, funding, policies. This structure doesn't exist for people of African descent on the EU level. So we can learn from the others, but also others can learn from us. So we can actually help kind of to build those alliances. Very recently, I was in New York on a meeting it was kind of a side event close to the UN big meeting. What was it? General Assembly happening 2 months ago in New York. And I was there together with Dalit people, with Kombonia people from Brazil, with African different group of people, and with some also Aborigines from Australia. And actually it was amazing how we could have worked together. We could have actually give a place to all kinds of different discrimination and supporting each other. So then when we had a People's Assembly very close to the UN headquarters, and there were the Dalit people saying Opre Roma, next to Jai Bean and other words that would be typical for their groups, I felt like things are moving, things are changing, things are going to a certain direction because we are not alone. And if the other groups would also be able to call Opre Roma, which mean like Roma up, supporting the Romani people, we may actually also kind of get from this internalization position that we are kind of victim position, we are alone and we have to fight just on our own means. So somehow I still feel there is a lot of room for it, but very importantly, and I think that also helps, that if we say that anti-Gypsyism or any kind of racism, it's a problem of the majority of society, then we have to pressure the majority of society. And if they see us as those being the second-class citizens, so it's also hardly us to bring the narrative and to change the narrative. So that's why these coalition building are so important. I would like to say also something more concrete, if you are actually interested in like what exactly and how we can do the things. So there is this very concrete example of a policy process which is happening right now, and it's the post-2020, where also Dan was there, and Anastasia, and maybe a few people in the room. 1st of October workshop, when also 1st of October workshop in Brussels. So DG Justice, responsible for Roma guidance, guiding the member states on Roma inclusion, organize a workshop. They also commissioned a study, a research by Roma, non-Roma experts on actually different fields. Anti-Gypsyism was one of the fields. We were not particularly happy with the results, but also that was even kind of even more important for us to get organized in advance. And in Ergo Network, with the help of the Alliance, which I mentioned already, and also Open Society Foundations, we kind of gathered the civil society the day before to kind of look at what is on in those papers, what is our position, and what is that we want. So, and actually we came very well prepared to the meeting with our points organized on paper, but also on our minds, and that we could relate to those who are building the policies, like on a very concrete level, to say like comment to almost every part, structural part of the documents, and making sure that our voice is being repeated. We even had a WhatsApp group in really kind of organizing ourselves in a way to make sure that the message is being heard. And now the work is continuing, because we are expecting that the guidance from the Commission will come during the German presidency of the European Commission, which is in the second half of 2020. By that time, European Commission has to prepare the guideline for the member state. But in the same time, it's also quite late, because if we think that at this very moment, also the funding and all the programming, how the money is going to be spent, it's also being prepared in the same time. So it's two parallel processes. So one is to kind of how to spend the money, and one should be on what the money should be spent. But these people very often don't talk together. So this is also our work, and I think, unfortunately, to kind of hold these institutions accountable and to make sure, that these work together, and that those who are helping to build the strategy on the national level are actually aware of those processes. I can be empowered to step in them and to interact with those institutions. So with the knowledge that we can help to bring also from understanding what is happening on this kind of abstract EU waters. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriela. I'm not sure it's working. Sorry. It's working? Good. So thank you very much for sharing these important details about the work of Ergo and others in the past years to bring about an understanding of what anti-Gypsyism is, push and advocate for its recognition along examples of expression of this phenomenon, which you are right, it's not a new one, and Anastasia also rightly clarified this. It's actually what Roma have been subjected since they came to the European continent, which is by now a millennia, and that's a serious issue, because throughout the entire history of Roma on the European continent, Roma have been victims of oppression, of marginalization, of exclusion. It's not since long that Roma were victims of slavery. It's not working. People are saying it's not working. Roma were victims of slavery for centuries, victims of deportation, of genocide, and they've been part of the Holocaust. I'm very happy to see here Mr. Ruzicka, Tevez it's very nice to see a person whose family was subjected to this kind of oppressive policies, and he was fighting for the proper recognition of this. Czech Republic is nowadays in a very positive trend after many years of advocacy and reluctance to engage in a proper and genuine process. I'm speaking of the Letiu Piscu and the experience of Roma during the Second World War. There's going to be the pig farm is dismantled. There is a lot of archaeological and research work done. There are very good premises that in the coming years a museum will be erected there. So these are important developments. But there are also a strong indicator that what happened to Roma throughout history is the effect of anti-Gypsyism and its expression. We still have some time. Both our speakers were well within the designated time limit of 15 minutes, and I think we have time now to take questions or interventions from the floor, and I encourage you to do so by raising your hand. I'm trying to keep a list, then give you the floor. Try to be as concise and as clear as possible, starting with introducing yourself, name and institution. Thank you. I'll take now hands. First there, please. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Kamilovin speaking. I'm from Western University of Bohemia. My question is simple.
No, sorry, the voice, louder.
Yeah, my
Yes.
question is simple. We know many examples of really bad monster politicians in current Europe who are representing worst of the humankind. So my question is, what would you recommend? What, in the contrary, what kind of politicians? Do you have any good example of politicians in current Europe? I mean, like Germany, France, on Brussels level, who are really representing what UNV stand for? Thank you very much.
I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but can I say that from where I sit, I don't think we can let any politician off the hook. Firstly, it seems to me that the Council of Europe protocol for political parties and candidates at times of election needs to stand, because times of election are very often when there is very explicit anti-Gypsyism expressed as a tool for getting election. So I think it's really important that that standard is used both in local elections and in national elections and in European elections. In my own country, the first time it wasn't used, because they dismantled the National Committee on Racism, which I used to chair. I think they thought that was a grand way to get rid of me. The first time it wasn't used was in the presidential election last year, and that was the first time we had very explicit anti-traveller racism, anti-Gypsyism in an election in Ireland. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, I think it's really important that all politicians then are, subjected to a rigid party whip, that the political parties in their actions are subjected to some sort of standards. As regards individuals, I don't know in France at the moment, in France or Germany, who those individuals are, Gabriele may, but it seems to me that depending on an individual who's elected at a particular point in time may be useful for one instrument then. But what's really important is that national parliaments as well, in their standing orders, and local councils in their standing orders, have within their standing orders things that disallow. In my own country, again, the only time the Unionists and the Republicans in Northern Ireland used to sit together in the same room during the council proceedings in the time of the Troubles was when they would sit together to make sure that the vote against a traveller halting site went through. You know, so I think we need standing orders that create conditions where there isn't that space for politicians to be anti-gypsy, to display anti-gypsy sentiments very directly. And of course we need to encourage the ones who are taking a better stand, but I'll leave that to you, maybe, Gabriele.
Because I tried to say, I also didn't understand well the question. So.
I will say it again. Do you know any good politician, like namely, who are representing your voice? Because I do understand that NGOs are doing really well, but we need some more support on a governmental level. Thank you.
Okay, so I can speak well for what is happening in Brussels on the EU level. So to be very, very concrete, so in this current parliament, the new parliament that was elected in May, so we have people for next 5 years term. We have 3 Roma sitting in the parliament. These people actually are two of them are very well voicing the Roma voice. So one is Romeo Franz. He's from Germany. He's there for a Green Party. And actually he's taking up work of already mentioned Soraya Post. Soraya Post, she was a previous parliament, Roma woman from Sweden. Unfortunately, she was not re-elected. She was actually running on the feminist list in Sweden, Roma woman on feminist list. I mean, we were so proud of her. Unfortunately, she didn't make it. She didn't make it this time. But Romeo Franz, he took a lot of work up on him. And newly we also have Peter Polák, he's from Slovakia. He used to be a plenipotentiary in Slovakia. He was also a national politician in the national parliament of Slovakia. So practically this guy, he knows also quite well how to orient himself in the different policy levels. And he's there like for now 2 months. We also have Livia Jaroka. She's a Hungarian Roma. But she's on the Fidesz list, so it's a little bit complicated for us as well, you know, how to work with her practically. But she's also a chairwoman of a European Parliament, so her position is the ever highest position Roma in such a structure had. So I think it's also interesting in a one way that practically the European People's Party gave kind of acknowledge or kind of elected a Roma woman in such a position, though she's also the one that articulating not for a Roma specific kind of framework. She would not articulate the anti-Gypsyism, and she would go just for poverty strategies that because Roma are poor. So practically what we talk about here on the first part of the day, she would kind of go against our main objective. So it's hard for us to work with her, you can understand. So these two are very well placed. We need more people, so we are also building further alliances. I didn't mention here one of the tools we are using in European Parliament. It's so-called Roma Week. It's a series of action during the 1 week when we bring different actors, civil society, institutions, and the politicians, to bring different issues. It's always around the 8th of April, which is the International Roma Day. And last year we had more than 25, about 30 parliamentarians kind of signing up for the Roma Week. About 60 which is still little from 700 plus European Parliament people, signed a declaration that they would help us to fight the anti-Gypsyism specifically. You know, so we actually went around and we did lobby before the elections who is going to take the costs up after the elections, and we had more than 60 parliamentarians signing up for this. Many of them were actually, majority of them were elected. So this Roma Week, so we're also encouraging civil society to do these Roma Weeks in the member states, because national parliaments are very rarely involved. So we very often we take government as or ministries as a target when we want, but the parliamentarians are not so much engaged. So we still want to do this a little bit more, but it also depends on the member state level. And where we are actually now also achieving some change, in Spain there are like 4 members of the parliament at this very moment, I would forgot, national parliament, because otherwise we almost have none in the EU. It's really very bad. You know, so the Spain now they have 4 members, Roma members of the parliament, though there is no new elections now, so we don't know how many of them will be re-elected, but so they have elections after 1 year of existence of the government, but still. But where we really standing quite well, and I think it's coming on the local level. So the local level engagement, it's increasing. So only in Slovakia we have about 30 plus 2, I think, well, 32 mayors. And I think this is an amazing result, especially if we know that Slovakia also has this kind of very dense areas where mostly Roma living, so that the Roma actually manage to kind of become the agents of their own life and step into the leading position. So this is it. We have few councillors, members of the councils, but still not so many. Few hundreds, yeah. But I mean, in Czech Republic we have just like 4, you know, and we had a quite big campaign this before these local elections, and still we didn't achieve to kind of manage to have the people in the position. So, you know, I think it's still quite a way. Very often the way it's not the Roma party, but sort of much more like kind of running on the mainstream party, but the good positions. So they are like, but it's a different topic. We trigger discussion.
Okay, so
Very good.
the gentleman from Greece, I think, then Elena.
I'm Panagiotis Dimitrios from Greece, and you didn't trigger my question. It's Anastasia's experience at CERT, where the one thing that I remember every time a country is reviewed is, do you have an impact assessment of your policies and of your projects? The feeling is that we're talking about the European Union, which is spending millions, and I am not sure that a real impact assessment, not a one that ends, and I've been in such programs, the program and nobody really says anything, an impact assessment that will show the real impact years after the end of a project is launched. I think this is something that we are lacking within the EU, and we should be pushing for. That's the one suggestion, and I do remember that this is the one thing that every time I was going to Geneva, UN committees were asking every country, assess the impact of your policies really, with the cooperation of those, of course, concerned with NGOs, not just an impact assessment at the office of a ministry. That was the comment.
Take 2 or 3 minutes.
I have Suzette, or Elena, I think Elena, and then Suzette. Elena, please.
Just a very quick point I wanted to say, because Gabriela was talking mostly about the Roma politicians. But what is very important is that also to have a non-Romas together working with the Roma politicians in the EU national parliaments or whatever. But what my sense is that if we, for example, didn't, this conditionals in English, awful. If we hadn't have Soraya, and if we now don't have Romeo and Peter, I don't see that we would have like nothing, like not a big actions in the parliament, you know, without this Roma. But then once we have them, then we have also supporters or allies to work together. That's my impression. I think that's very important, so the Roma participation in politics becomes really important. But my question is that if we are going to talk about online hate speech specifically, because what I was interested and why I am in this workshop is because I wanted to hear from people, especially about this relatively new initiative of the ex-commissioner Vera Jourova, because she introduced this code of conduct to combat illegal hate speech. And then with all this Facebook, YouTube, they made these agreements, and there are people who are involved in reporting to the Commission about this, like the so-called trusted flaggers. Yes. And I'm curious how this works, if there is any impact. Do you know anything about it? Thank you.
I'm Suzette, Secretary General of INACH. We participate in these monitoring exercises. The problem is a little bit that, for instance, when we do a monitoring exercise, this is announced to the social media well ahead of time. So everybody that participates gets all these emails and bombarded with phone calls. Can we help you? And of course, the 6 weeks of the monitoring exercise, they're excellent. Now, we've used sort of anonymous flaggers. They don't get a response. We have trusted flagger status. We're at a point now, what does it mean? We're trusted flaggers to make them look good. That's all. So that's a bit of a difficult point. We did a monitoring exercise without announcing it, also not to the European Commission. So we had very different results from the regular monitoring exercises. You can find it on our website, the outcome. And funny enough, since then, it's been much harder to reach social media. And also the European Commission frowns upon it a bit. Because they, for some reason, are scared of social media. So they're trying to appease everybody, which of course, I mean, shit or get out of the pot. Does that answer your question? Do you have anything to say to that? Because I also have a question, apart from that.
We'll have your question first.
Okay.
We'll say it all then.
I was wondering, because the institutions are kind of middlemen between NGOs and governments, although they're government steered. And I wonder, apart from like ECRI, FRA, and ODIHR bringing out statements on special days, like Holocaust Memorial Day, the 21st of March, Roma Remembrance, do you cooperate in more ways to push joint agenda points, using the NGOs for information and then putting it forward to governments? And for instance, the independent bodies in the different countries get together to push agendas.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I would still start with this kind of anecdotal also result of the code of conduct that I very often heard from Vera Jourova, the Commissioner for Justice, when she was presenting the results of the code of conduct and how actually successful it was, and you know how, or at least she was always saying the negotiations with the providers, you know, were successful. She never talked about the results. The only result she ever mentioned, I think Romea is much more aware of how the whole work went. It was the kind of trial with Patrick Banga, where actually it was taking almost 2 years, you know, to kind of react on the hate speech online, and it was like a machinery of practically victimizing the victim. So although there was a very good results in, you know, kind of finding out that this and identifying this as a hate speech, then the process which followed was still a failure. And even there was a fine to pay by the perpetrators. The fine was very little; it was something like €5, and the whole process that also Patrick himself had went through. It's not process for everybody. You have to have really guts and patience, and even resources to actually follow on those things. So I think that still we are like kind of like this online and offline, that it has several phases that we have to go through, and all the actors has to actually understand what the anti-gypsyism is and how to handle those situations, and not to put victim in even worse situation, actually even winning but feeling like losing your own life 2 years in the whole process. So I think that there is still several battles in this field, and it's just showing how complicated the battlefields for us are. When it comes to those kind of creating alliances with the different actors, we are working on it. So I think the alliance, it's one of the things. So we already kind of started to go also beyond the network, which is like Ergo, so to kind of have really other actors. We had for many years Roma Policy Coalition in Brussels, which kind of get all these bigger institutions together, but still civil society, but kind of well established, but also not only Roma, but also different, like Anti-Poverty Network, or Public Health Alliance, or Eurochild, just to mention few, to make sure that we work together. We're also kind of trying to kind of acknowledge ourselves on what we are doing. So practically, when OSCE is organizing event, they're always inviting us to feed into the work. The Council of Europe is doing the same. So when we are there, we have a possibility to comment on the things and give the inputs, which are then being taken forward. In this time, we also have very good cooperation with the with the Brussels Office of High Commission for Human Rights of the United Nations. I think that they work very, very well with us. It's more like that also. Now we are going to have an event, so we're also inviting them as speakers. So this sort of like a kind of partnership level works on kind of reinforcing our messages.
No, I know what you're saying.
But together, I still don't see a full action. I see much easier. For example, I mentioned this Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights in Brussels. When they make a press release or some kind of action, they don't go with us, but they go with Equinet, with another institution. So I see like institutions going more easily together than with civil society, because I think also the process, but it's not me to speak on behalf of the institutions. I think also I think the process is different when kind of acknowledging the work and going together. So.
I agree with you, but to be perfectly honest with you, I think some of us have got to get inside those institutions sometimes as well. Personally speaking, I was the chair of FRA when there was a decision made that there should be a major study undertaken of discrimination against Roma, the first one. And I have to say, without being nice to myself, if it wasn't for me and one or two other people on the board at the time, and being chair probably helped a little bit too, that would not have happened. Because you can take it for granted that within those institutions, some of those issues will not be prioritized. So I think it's really important that the sort of event that you're talking about, Gabriella, those partnership events are very important. They're important as door openers. But we absolutely need to go beyond that as civil society, I think. And I think it's really important that people are elected to these institutions, people have opportunities to engage with them, and that the institutions are pushed or lobbied to actually take on the agenda, because verbally on the special days they will. But FRA has taken on that agenda, ECRI has, of the Council of Europe have taken it on, and the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities very frequently reports on Roma in their national reports. But there are some dangers as well in these policy instruments. And the first one I would say at the moment for me is that the difference between citizens and residents particularly in Europe, needs to be very explicitly understood, because a lot of policies that are pushed forward nationally and even at a European level differentiate in that way so that they privilege so-called citizens, whereas residents within the Union and from outside the Union are contributing significantly to what's happening in this part of the world and even outside the European Union as well. Secondly, it seems to me that the specific ways in which policies are developed of going around and asking a few people what they need is very often a quick way of avoiding addressing their long-term interests or the racism or anti-gypsyism they experience. So, for example, if you talk about needs, if you have no house, of course your need is for accommodation. If you have no education, but like that can be individualized in a way that doesn't get to the roots of the reality that's causing the accommodation crisis for Roma and Sinti and travellers throughout Europe at the moment. So I think that's really important. Thirdly, at the moment in the policy context, there's a focus on mainstreaming. I found it interesting that day we were in Brussels on the 1st of October, that yet again there's a focus on mainstreaming. Now, I've no problem with mainstreaming sometimes. Mainstreaming is really important. I've yet to meet a Roma or traveller parent who wants their children to be in segregated education, provided all other things are equal. But mainstreaming without special measures to create conditions for Roma and travellers and Sinti to be equal within the mainstream simply don't work. And this leads me to the question about CERD and impact. CERD and all of the United Nations bodies have what in CERD are called special measures. In the European Union it's called positive action. But, and I think it's really important that we, in policy terms, look for those special measures, both on and offline, and in the bridge that comes between the two of them. As regards impact then, and impact assessment, you're right, but I think part of the problem, having been part of both the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, CERD, and the Fundamental Rights Agency, and European Union monitoring mechanisms, is the clever way in which states play one off against the other. So, for example, states coming to CERD for the last decade would sit in front of you and say about the great strategy they had in place for Roma, or the wonderful equality body they had in place. And I would be literally jumping up and down with rage, trying to get my hand up to contradict them and to say, sorry, you know, and other members would be saying how wonderful that was, people from outside Europe maybe, and I would be saying, well, sorry, you have to have those. And in one or two cases you were being dragged, kicking and screaming to the Luxembourg court before you put in place the single equality body. And each country was obliged to have, or should have had, a Roma strategy over the last decade. So I think in terms of answering your question about impact, we in civil society, particularly when we come to on and offline instruments, need to be very careful to build on the instruments, the policy possibilities that are around us, to get the maximum from them, rather than allowing states to very politely play one off, to play one off against the other. And lastly, as regards the voluntary framework for reporting, taking on board your very good response. The point I was making earlier is that the only incursion into that I think the human rights issues are beginning to make now is this kind of new proposal that international human rights law and the international human rights instruments should inform that monitoring, and that key dimensions of that need to be taken on board. I don't think it's enough still, but I think it's an important step forward beyond just that brief acknowledgement.
Any more questions? I see a hand there, please. Introduce yourself and then pose the question or have the comment.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Cox and I come from Slovakia. Our organization, DGQ, works in promotion of digital citizenship and protecting human rights, mostly online. I have a remark or two remarks and a plea for you. When I had a brief look at numbers, Mr. Polak was elected approximately with 2%, 2.4% of votes within Slovakia, whilst there is 8% of Roma representation within Slovakia. So this is when it comes to the political representation of Roma. And I believe he was elected not because he is Roma, but because he has good ideas. So definitely the Roma organization need to work more with raising awareness about them wanting a political representation as such. And again, like when it comes to the legislation against discrimination and increasing the status of Roma population in Slovakia, we do have them all, they're just not implemented. That's the problem. But my plea is actually inspired by what Suzette mentioned. So we're also involved in the monitoring exercise. And anytime we start the monitoring exercise, we ask the public and the organizations, befriended organizations, to report the cases of online hate speech to us. It rarely comes from Roma in Slovakia. It rarely comes. So those who stand against discrimination of Roma online are mostly non-Romani, so we really need to work more with this target group. So my plea is, if you can, when you talk to the Roma organizations in Slovakia, tell them, report these cases. And I absolutely admire, I see it often, for example, what's happening here in the Czech Republic. If there's a targeted hate against Roma online, the people who stand more for Roma are Roma themselves. In Slovakia, it doesn't really happen. And I know that you, from the Czech Republic, might be very skeptical about this, but it's much worse in Slovakia. So, but this is what we need to do. We need to fight against hate speech together with them. And as Mr. Rishavi mentioned, the case when the Czech president said that 80% of Roma do not work, and there were hundreds of photos of Roma working being sent online. This is what we need. This is what we need in Slovakia. So thank you very much.
And thank you. Are there interventions or questions? Okay. If not, I may also touch upon something that was mentioned by some of the speakers about how we take information from organizations and then include or introduce elements of them into our agenda or help conveying them to the other international and intergovernmental organizations. With the OSCE ODIHR and with the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues, we organize every year a gathering of Roma participants coming from organizations or individual experts or freelancers to participate in the human dimension implementation meetings, special topics on Roma. Sometimes it's one session. This year, we were lucky to have a full special day on Roma and Sinti. And we bring them usually between 15 to 20 people one day before, and we help them understand the format, the environment, the setting, and how they can make a best use of this forum to convey their message for the participating states as well as for the OSCE institutions and structures. And it works, and we always get good recommendations, and we are made aware of both existing challenges and problems as well as some of the good developments and good practices or positive initiatives and so on. But actually, this year we've done a little bit more. Within the OSCE action plan for improving the situation of Roma and Sinti issues, which was adopted in Maastricht in 2003, so it's a document which is already 16 years old, but is as valid as yesterday and 16 years ago. There is one provision which hints to a sort of a mechanism, an entity that is recognized in the OSCE Action Plan, and it's called the International Roma Contact Group. And this is supposed to bring the most relevant, the most active Roma organizations together with elected people and a number of other active Roma NGOs to discuss from Roma to Roma and among Roma about what they think is the most important for them, internationally and nationally. What they think is top priority for them, and we often see that what Roma believe is a top priority is not what European institutions consider that it's a priority or a need or an emergency for Roma. So there is still a gap, a disconnect between the priorities as set by European institutions and other international organizations and what Roma really want. And we gather this information and we facilitate that process in a very open way, encouraging self-criticism. So it's not only to look at the institutions and how bad they are or what good things they do, but also to look introspectively into our Roma community. And make no mistake, there are huge problems. Maybe from outside, very often, sometimes organizations and institutions see that Roma act in a coherent way, in a unified way. No, it's not like that, actually. We are very, very fragmented. So we don't make an exception from the rule of human beings. We are the same as everyone else. The problem is that while others may afford this kind of dysfunctions because they are not so much affected by exclusion, discrimination, and racism and so on, Roma cannot afford that. We are in such a dire situation that we must unite. So my small contribution is to offer such space, which is not often the case. Many of the international events do not offer sufficient space for Roma to express themselves and discuss among themselves about what they think is the most important. So I facilitated such process and I intend to continue, and the contact point, I hope it will continue this very good practice. And a step further, you know, all the findings and the recommendations that this group, this International Roma Contact Group, will have for the OSCE institutions and structures and for participating states and other international organizations, I intend to pass it over in another mechanism that it's part of the OSCE Action Plan, which is called the Informal Contact Group of the Intergovernmental Organizations, which is supposed to bring together every year representatives of the European Union, European Commission, Fundamental Rights Agency, Council of Europe, and so on, and discuss about our agendas, our plans, intentions, with a view to try and find synergies and avoid overlapping. And yes, there is a lot of overlapping and unnecessary redundancy, which translates often in a waste of money. Very often, even those money and funds which are allocated do not necessarily respond to what Roma believe is most important. But even if those funding will be implemented properly, would bring about some positive changes for Roma. But very often, even those are redundant and to some extent a waste. So this kind of outcome from such a gathering of Roma, which is self-reflecting but also reflecting towards institutions, will be passed. So I hope it will also inform every process post-2020 of the European Union, of UN bodies, of the Council of Europe, and also for the OSCE. Thank you. I believe we are about to close, but
say something
yes,
very
please,
small, because
please,
I think,
Anastasia.
I think one of the things I meant to say earlier is that I think policy in the area we're trying to focus on, and policy with regard to hate speech or people reporting online incidents, I mean, in my experience, the more any group feels that there's going to be no outcome from it, the less they're going to report it. You know, and this is not just unique to Roma, this is a fairly universal experience. And I think perhaps we need to risk sometimes taking initiatives that can actually demonstrate some capacity to begin to address things, whether they're individual cases or otherwise. In that regard, for example, with regard to other policy, I'm conscious of an initiative that I've been involved in Ireland since 1985 as a young lecturer in a university department. I decided that travellers had been long enough outside the gates, and that from then on, every year on the programmes that I had anything to do with, there was going to be a traveller. And there has been since 1985, and I have to say it was stoutly resisted to begin with. But and as a consequence, more recently, we've succeeded in persuading the Higher Education Authority to set a very clear target for travellers in higher education, a numerical target. And then I realised that what they were doing was actually making sure they all went to the lower level, third level institutions. So I insisted that the target was set for each institution individually. Now, it's something small, but it's what was against it was the idea that these people, as mature, women in particular, as mature students, haven't come through the education system and therefore won't be able to manage it. Of course they were able to manage it, well able to manage it, and they've gone on to do all sorts of things since then. But it does demand, I think, in terms of policy, that we write down or we consider what the policy might look like from the point of view, what the outcomes might look like from the point of view of the people for whom the policy is supposed to be targeted, rather than what the outcomes might look like from the point of view of the institution or the others who are making. And those policies for Roma, as far as I'm concerned, accommodation being another one, do mean going the road less travelled, you know, and considering things that wouldn't otherwise be considered. I think the same applies in this area we're trying to look at this morning. Thank you.
I thank you both, Anastasia, and a last word from Gabriela as well.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to use this few-minute opportunity. I'm also happy to hear the comment from Slovakia, practically, that when it comes to the elections, that also very often it's actually true that Roma are also, and I think actually it's a very good result when a Roma candidate is also being elected by non-Roma, to look on the positive side of the whole story. When it comes to the reporting and kind of engaging more the civil society and especially the Roma to report, I just can promise from my own organization that from March next year we are engaging in a new project. Unfortunately, Slovakia is not in as our country, but we might still kind of use some opportunities to extend the work in the future. And we're going to work with the students, Romani students from universities, and to train them in understanding the anti-Gypsyism, and to act as a peer educators for the others to actually do the reporting. So also not focusing so much on the civil society as such, but mostly on young people, on those who are spending the time online, quite big time online, so to make sure that actually they understand what is happening and that how to react on it. And I think in that case, I can just flag that actually what we would need, and that I think that's very relevant now also for the previous comments, is to make sure that then we work with those trusted flaggers and to make sure that practically those reports we will be bringing up will be also sort of recognized, and the accidents will be taken down. So this is something that the Ergo Network will now slowly engage in. We also ask support from Google, so let's see, we might even extend the work. Actually, I think they never give to any Roma organization and money. We apply for work in 8 countries. I have a call with them at 1 actually, so so we are shortlisted already. So I'm saying it out loud for you to cross the fingers, not to wish us the best. So to get a little bit more engaged, because we see this is a gap. And although it's also like now we're speaking much more on the policies, I think the implementation and how our people are engaging, I think is the most crucial. So you can hear from, I think you will hear from us in the next time, and we will, like in the coming years, let's say, from this field, and we will also be calling for a kind of closer cooperation.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers, Suzette, Ronald, INACH, and also Romea for broadcasting live this event, and I would like to thank you for your patience and interventions. The workshop is closed. Yeah, I can take it now. Thank you very much.